It's January 28th, 1986, and after a few days of delays and anticipation building up with the crowd across the Cape, Challenger came to life and lifted off the pad. The air was freezing, but the excitement from the crowd was warm. It was a new chapter, and was opening up so much for NASA and America at the time. But this chapter doesn't end like everyone hopes it will. When onlookers, classmates, teachers, and all of America watched as Challenger launches, with 7 souls on board, including the American history teacher Krista McAuliffe, they were not prepared for what would happen next. Challenger explodes due to an O-ring malfunction. No one could have known that this was going to happen. But they did. The engineers, the technicians, the managers at Thiokol and NASA knew. Or did they?
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is...
Now, before we get into the neon lights and the chain smoking of the 80s, let's go back to the 60s, where the world was truly captivated by the space race and the space program in and of itself. Kennedy had made an announcement of putting a man on the moon before the decade was out, back in 1961, and 5 years later, the Apollo program is underway. It's August 1966. The Apollo 1 capsule is in its last inspection before being delivered for its first test launch that will follow the next year. Joseph Shea, the Apollo spacecraft program office manager, had concerns brought up to him by both technicians and engineers and astronauts about the nylon netting and the Velcro in the cabin because of the fear that it would cause a fire. Shea had given the orders to remove anything flammable from the cabin, but he never oversaw these orders personally, an oversight that will cause serious complications and damage in the future. In early October of 1966, Shea gets a letter from a man named Hilliard Page, the Missile and Space Division senior executive at GE, and in his letter to Shea, Page warned him about the high possibility of a fire, writing, "I do not think it's technically prudent to be unduly influenced by the ground and flight success of Mercury and Gemini under a 100% oxygen environment. The first fire in a spacecraft may as well be fatal." So, a few weeks later, before the main crew could test the actual Apollo 1 capsule, a backup flight crew tested the capsule themselves. And according to the final report on the Accident Prevention Board, the crew was satisfied with the performance of this craft. This statement, however, was contradicted by the accounts given by the flight crew themselves. James Lovell, a fellow astronaut at the time, recounted that Schirra made it clear that he was not pleased with what he had seen, and that he had later warned Grissom and Shea that there's nothing wrong with this ship that I can point to, but it just makes me uncomfortable. Something about it doesn't ring right, and that Grissom should get out at the first sign of trouble. It's test day, and the 3 astronauts assigned for Apollo 1's official launch in February, Grissom, Chafe, and White, are all in their seats, strapped and ready for a plug-out test. A plug-out test is to make sure the capsule can run on its own without the need for external power. The requirements for this test is a full spacesuit, pressurized oxygen, and a sealed cabin. There had been multiple issues with this test, delaying things until 6:30 p.m. The hatch had been closed and the capsule had 100% oxygen in it by this time. The T- counter was still set at 10, but due to an unexpected voltage surge, by 6:31, the cabin is on fire. With the combination of 100% pure oxygen and the nylon in the cabin, the fire was untamable. It took 5 men, a fire extinguisher, and a handful of minutes to put the fire out. But it was too late. It was far too late. Not by seconds, not by minutes, but by years. What was left of the men inside were memorialized in their last action. Gus Grissom and Ed White were at the foot of the hatch with their suits melted and charred, and Chafe was still sitting in his seat trying to keep comms open for as long as he could. The pad leader went back to his desk not too far away and picked up a phone that connected him to the control room. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "I cannot describe what I see." The Apollo 1 fire could have easily been avoided if the voices of concern had been listened to more intently, with more urgency. Joseph Shea could be given leniency, but seeing that he was the manager that oversaw Apollo 1, he wrote a contract and signed a contract in the blood of Grissom, Chafe, and White. And they are the ones that paid the ultimate price. The 80s were not nice to NASA. To give some background that can be directly connected to NASA's ever-growing struggle to succeed, its continuous errors, and its lack of safety provisions was money, or the lack thereof, especially during the early 80s. And going from a president that would write a blank check and just throw it at NASA to nearly losing 80% of its funds once Reagan was in office. The 80s, and the early recession of it, hit NASA hard, and it hit it fast. This put a lot of pressure on NASA to prove itself useful to the government. NASA also had to fight to stay in the public eye, which had slowly been losing interest in the space program since they put a man on the moon. The concept of the space shuttle program was pitched to the US government as a low-cost space drug. NASA confidently said that the program would be able to pay for itself as it matured, basically, and that the 12 shuttles that they planned on making would be able to launch at least every month. The government bought into this and gave them a budget of $5.5 billion. This is where the space shuttle program and NASA are put to the test. With years of delays, with the program's formal conception back in 1977, the 2 men were finally sitting in the laid-back position, strapped to their seats. John Young and Robert Crippen were selected for Columbia's first test flight. It was a simple test: launch, orbit Earth and land within a 2-day time frame. When the countdown reached 0 and the 2 high-powered solid fuel rockets roared to life, the men were pushed back into their seats. It was terrifying and yet exciting. And after 2 days of orbiting Earth, the men landed safely at Edward Air Force Base in California, where they were met with applause and congratulations. President Reagan had deemed the program a success and looked forward to the future of what NASA's latest program had to offer. NASA got right to work constructing 3 more spaceship orbiters for the program, since the enthusiasm from both the public and the president had skyrocketed. And on July 4th, 1982, Columbia had made another successful landing, and President Reagan had made the announcement of the Challenger space shuttle, which was unveiled at the airstrip. But back at Cape Canaveral, Columbia's solid rocket boosters had parachuted down into the Atlantic, and a pair of recovery ships waited and retrieved the boosters. They were taken back to a docking hangar at the Cape where Thiokol engineers watched the boosters be disassembled methodically. Once properly taken apart, technicians would examine the boosters and spot something odd, an anomaly. A synthetic rubber gasket on the right-hand rocket booster was partially vaporized during this 2-minute launch. The technicians filed a report about the damage that was caused to the O-ring in this booster. But NASA was gearing up for another flight at the time. With the space shuttle program fully underway now, NASA had full confidence in themselves and with their latest shiny new program. They had come to learn quickly that their mouths were bigger than their stomachs. When NASA couldn't keep up with their own demands, the government especially would notice. NASA had to put on a front for the government to show that the program was working with minimal issues. But behind the scenes, it was much different. There were a lot of struggles that the space shuttle program had been facing that can be traced back to the solid rocket boosters. The rocket boosters were dangerous. There was no safety measures when it came to being strapped to what might as well have been a missile, and once these boosters were lit, you were going to take off whether you liked it or not. And those 2 minutes were the most crucial and dangerous part of the entire mission. And after those 2 minutes, the rockets would fall away and parachute down into the Atlantic where they would be retrieved. Now, how are these rockets made? How are they put together? How do they work, really? And why did they have such an issue with O-rings? And why the continuous failure with almost every single launch? Well, let me explain. This is the solid rocket booster, or at least what it is on print. The plans for it, at least. And I'm going to explain this to you as best as I can possible. I am not an engineer. I don't have an engineering degree. I had to watch several videos in order for me to understand this, so I apologize if this does not make any sense. There is going to be a link down below that you can follow that explains it a lot better than me. But from my understanding, this is basically what it is. So this would be the tang, which is like a U shape, basically. So it's like the male part of the solid rocket booster. And then this right here would be the kelvis. The kelvis is the Y-shaped part or the female part. So basically what would happen is that you have this, and then the tang would slot in, and then pins would be put out on the outside of the rocket booster, basically. And then in order for it to be airtight, you would have your O-rings, which are right here. In the first iteration of the solid rocket booster, there's only one O-ring. There's only one O-ring that they used for the solid rocket booster. And then to try and combat the fact that it was eroding, vaporizing during these launches, they would add a second one, which was like the fail-safe, basically. And so what would happen is that there's this zinc putty right here, and you have like this tiny square gap. I'm not sure if you guys can see it, but there's this tiny square gap right here between the O-rings and the zinc putty, which when the rocket would take off, it would pressurize, it would put pressure on this, on the zinc, and the zinc would put pressure on this. And so what was supposed to happen is that this is supposed to pressurize down, squeeze the O-rings down, like flatten them like pancakes a little bit, and push them against the tang. But what would happen is that the rocket would rotate, not rotate like this, even though I'm making this movement. It would not make the rotation that we think it is. It would make basically, if you're blowing into, let's say, an empty water bottle and it like expands just a little bit. So it would expand. The rocket pieces would expand just a little bit, so the tang and the pelvis, which is supposed to be like this, would bend like that a little bit, and it would cause a blow-by on the O-rings for just a split second, causing, obviously these gases on hot airs to escape. And this is a big no-no. This is not what's supposed to happen with these rockets. It's supposed to just straight up seal up and cause an airtightness to it, and it wouldn't cause this blow-by. But the problem is that this blow-by kept continuing. So great on paper, but not great in design. That half a second with that half a meter of space was deadly. This was also a factor in understanding Challenger's failure. The other factor? Weather. A whole year before Challenger would launch, Space Shuttle Discovery was on the pad getting ready for its own launch. It was 51 degrees outside, the coldest launch to date. Thiokol engineers at the time highly advised against the launch because of the fear of an O-ring failure occurring during cold weather. When the shuttle launched successfully, it seemed that there was no real worry about the cold at the time. But 6 months later, Roger Boyes-Jolly, an engineer of Thiokol, had found that the O-ring was next to useless as it wouldn't flex and fill the gaps at all. His findings were horrific, and knew that it was a miracle that Discovery had survived the 2-minute launch. Let's go back to 1984 really quick. With almost regular shuttle launches into space, the public was growing bored of watching, your average engineer, your astronaut, and even the occasional politician going into space. They wanted something different, something new. They wanted someone. And they didn't want new, they wanted ordinary. Ronald Reagan had made the announcement for the Teachers in Space program. The point of this program was to help inspire young students be interested in things such as mathematics and science and space, all while honoring teachers all over America. There were about 40,000 applicants mailed out to teachers all over. By June of 1985, the applications were whittled down to about 114 nominees. These 114 nominees would be invited to a summit and evaluated by 20 judges who were all made up of different backgrounds. By the next month, there were only about 10 nominees for the Space Shuttle program. And then 2 weeks later, the teacher who would be going into space would be announced.
The teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe. Is that you? Krista teaches in Concord High School in Concord, New Hampshire. She teaches...
Sharon Krista Corrigan was born in Boston on September 2nd, 1948. As the oldest of 5, it seemed that Sharon was always meant to be a teacher and to guide those around her. Her enthusiasm was so radiant that it brought Barbara and Krista together as close friends. During her time in school, she talked to her friends about the space age. She was invested in current NASA projects like the moon landing and Project Mercury. Along with her application to NASA, Krista wrote in her letter saying, "I watched the space age being born, and I would like to participate." Krista would go on to marry her longtime boyfriend Stephen J. McAuliffe and would have 2 kids, Scott and Caroline. Krista took her first teaching job as a junior high American history teacher in Morningside, Maryland. She'd go on to get a master's degree in education in 1978, and after 78, her family would move to New Hampshire, where she would get a teaching position in Concord's High School. One thing that I found out while trying to understand more about Krista, about her life and how she lived and what she did, was that the way she taught was special. She taught by bringing in ordinary speakers, people who you and I would consider mundane, normal, basic, wouldn't even bat an eye at. The New York Times even pointed this out, saying she emphasized the impact of ordinary people in history, saying they were as important to the historical records as kings, politicians, and generals. And an ordinary person is what Krista was. And an ordinary person is what NASA was looking for at the time. Although NASA considered Krista to be ordinary, she and the rest of her crewmates for Challenger were not. Francis R. Scobie was born May 19, 1939, in Cle Elum, Washington. Francis Scobie was a man meant for the stars. He enjoyed many things throughout his life, such as oil painting and outdoor activities. Scobie would graduate from the University of Arizona with a degree in aerospace engineering in 1965, and then received his Air Force wings in 1966. In 1978, Scobie would be selected as an astronaut candidate, and after a one-year training and evaluation, he would become eligible to be a shuttle pilot in future missions. Michael J. Smith was born April 30th in 1945 in Beaufort, North Carolina. Michael was dedicated to his country. He was a man who enjoyed things like woodwork and tennis. He also liked squash. He received a bachelor's degree in naval science from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1967. Then, in 1968, he got a degree in aeronautical engineering. In 1980, he was also selected by NASA to be an astronaut and went through the same one-year training and evaluation that Scobie went through. He completed the evaluation and was qualified to be a pilot, just like Scobie. Ellison Onizuka was born June 24, 1946, in Kealakekua, Kona, Hawaii, and graduated from the University of Colorado in 1969 with a degree in aerospace engineering. Ellison would be selected by NASA in 1978 and complete the same one-year training as Francis and Michael. Though he didn't become a pilot, he was well versed in other tasks, working with orbiter tests and software tests, and did checkout crews. He would be the first Asian in space. Judith A. Resnick was born April 5, 1949, in Akron, Ohio. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University in 1970. She would go to the University of Maryland to get her doctorate degree and graduate in 1977. Judith was into classical piano and enjoyed other activities such as bicycling and flying in her free time. In 1979, she completed her one-year astronaut training and got right to work on several projects that would support the orbiter development, such as experimental software, and the remote manipulator system, and astronaut training techniques. She would be the first Jewish woman in space. Ronald E. McNair was born October 21, 1950, in Lake City, North Carolina. He was a karate instructor and performed jazz on the saxophone. He also liked to cook, play football, play cards, and other sporting activities as well. He got a bachelor's degree in physics from North Carolina A&T State University in 1971, and a doctor of philosophy in physics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1976. He completed his one-year astronaut training in 1979 and qualified as a mission specialist for the Space Shuttle flight crews. He would be the first black man in space. He would also be the first person to play an instrument in space as well. Gregory B. Jarvis was born August 24, 1944, in Detroit, Michigan. Greg was into many outdoor sports like cross-country skiing and backpacking. In his downtime, he played the classical guitar. He received a bachelor's degree of science in electrical engineering from the University of New York. After schooling, he was involved in the Air Force and was assigned to the Space Division in California. In 1973, he was honorarily discharged and started to work in the Hughes Aircraft Company, where he worked as a communications integration manager. Greg did not have to do the one-year training and evaluation like his fellow astronauts. Today is launch day, or it's supposed to be. Weather had postponed the Challenger launch until the 26th. Challenger was then hit with another delay when the latch handle wouldn't lock properly and had to be sawed off. On the 27th, there were supposedly more storms coming in, but that morning, when the launch was supposed to take place, there were clear skies until later. NASA themselves were dealing with a whole other problem behind closed doors. Head engineers and technicians from Thiokol in Utah and NASA officials in Kennedy Space Center were put on a call together where they discussed whether or not to delay the Challenger launch once again, since Florida temperatures were dropping to a record low of about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 35 degrees lower than the Discovery launch a year earlier. The Thiokol engineers pushed for a no-go launch, as Roger Boisjoli and Alan McDonald, who was head engineer of Thiokol at the time, had presented evidence that if the O-ring were agitated due to the cold, there would be a high possibility of an explosion. Bob Ebling, another Thiokol engineer who had been pushing for years to keep the boosters from leaving the Thiokol plant until they fixed the O-ring problem, was also there to present information. Then Lawrence Malloy, head of NASA's SRB program, and the one representing NASA in the call, exclaimed to the engineers, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" So, NASA was pushing for a launch, saying that the data that was presented to them was inconclusive, while Thiokol refused to sign off on it due to safety concerns. A recess was called by Jerry Mason, the senior vice president of Thiokol, where he had a private discussion with the engineers in the room. This is where the infamous quote, "It's time to take your engineering hat off and put on your manager hat," Mason had told Bob, who was still fighting against the launch. By the time the recess was up, Thiokol reluctantly agreed to let Challenger launch in the morning. Malloy demanded a signed recommendation faxed to him after the meeting, to which Allen refused to sign. So, Joe Kilminster had signed it for him instead. Malloy would then call the NASA management team and get in touch with the team lead, Arnold Aldrich, where they would discuss and agree for Challenger to launch in the morning. Malloy, however, did not bring up Thiokol's engineers' concerns about the failure of an O-ring. None of it was mentioned to Aldrich. With the decision made by the higher-ups, and there was no backing down now, the 7 astronauts would enter the cockpit of Challenger one more time, and this would be with the intent to launch. Spectators watched the countdown closing in. With the icicles chiseled away and the sun shining down on such a cold day, people were regaining their enthusiasm for the launch. With the hatch perfectly sealed this time, comms as clear as the sky, and all seemed well on the outside. At Thiokol, the engineers from the night before had watched on a colored box TV. Boisjoli had gotten too antsy watching and tried retreating into his office, fearing of what he would see on TV. Ebling had to coax him back out to see what would happen. As the countdown was getting close to the single digits, the crowd across the lake miles away that contained the astronauts' families and Krista's family, along with Barbara Morgan, the backup teacher, all watched in anticipation. And then the timer hit 0, and the Challenger roared towards the sky.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, Challenger. Control program confirmed. Challenger.
Barbara waved goodbye to the shuttle as it rocketed towards the heavens, exclaiming, "Bye, Krista. Bye, crew."
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looks as though they were not going to be able
At the Kennedy Space Center, there was a mix of confusion and fear. The crowd at first thought it was normal, but someone quickly pointed out that something had gone wrong. Krista's parents watched helplessly, and Barbara, who had become very close with Krista and the rest of the crew, got down from the stands and ran towards the explosion, muttering things like, "Oh no," and "Krista." The Thiokol engineers, who had been watching, said nothing. Boisjoli went back to his office, and Ebling followed him once again. This time, not to stop him, but to embrace him in a hug as they both wept. That night, President Reagan had made an acknowledgement about the accident, quoting, "We will never forget them, as they slipped the surly bonds of earth and touched the face of God." A few days later, a memorial was held all across America. Everyone showed their sorrows in different ways. Flags were half-mast. Kids and students all over the country sent in nickels and dimes to NASA in hopes of building a new space shuttle for the one that they've lost. And Lady Liberty, whose fire was usually lit, had been extinguished. America was in mourning for the loss of the 7 brave souls, all while NASA and Thiokol, engineers, technicians, and managers alike, had been pooled together for what would be an investigation that would pull back the curtain and reveal the cold truths about the space shuttle program. President Reagan immediately opened up a commission for the investigation of Challenger's demise and appointed William Rogers to oversee the investigation. The Rogers Commission would open on February 6, 1986, and would last a little over 3 months. When the meeting first opened, it seemed that the Thiokol and NASA managers were willing to answer questions about anything other than the cold weather. Jerry Mason would do anything he could to turn away from such questions. It was clear that Jerry was only there to save face, and so was Lawrence Malloy, saying that night of the call with Thiokol engineers they had all agreed to launch. Alan MacDonald, who had been there during the call, saw this and knew he had to do something about it. So, at the time, Malloy had been taking questions from the commission when MacDonald had stood up and raised his hand in hopes of getting Malloy's attention. Malloy outright ignored him. And so, with shaking hands and sweaty palms, basically, MacDonald made his way to the front in hopes of getting Malloy's attention. And at the last minute, he does. Alan MacDonald finally spoke up. The recommendation at the time was to not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. General Kudiana, a member of Rogers' chairman alongside Sally Ride and Neil Armstrong, and Dr. Richard Feynman, asked what the temperature was that day of launch. Malloy answered, 29 degrees. It took a few more days before the point of the cold being an agitator to the O-ring had been made by no other than Dr. Feynman, who happened to be a Nobel Prize winner in physics. He had assembled a demonstration for the commission where he had taken the materials used for Challenger's O-ring, put the ring on clamps to stretch it out, and dump it in ice-cold water. He then pulled out the ring and detached it from the clamps, showing the commission and the people who were watching on live TV that the O-ring did not, in fact, stretch. It was a smoking gun. The commission from that day forth grilled the managers at Thiokol and at NASA, asking why they would ignore not just the engineers in the room, but the head engineers, including Bose Jolly, who would also go on to later testify about that night, saying that the men tried to pressure him and the engineers to sign off on the launch. For the remainder of the commission, the chairman and Rogers looked heavily into the O-ring failure and the weather conditions. They followed the paper trail that was left behind by the engineers at Thiokol. A handful of those documents coming from Bose Jolly's notes, letters, and journal documentations. By June 6, 1986, the Rogers Commission comes to a close. Their conclusion was that there was no one person to blame for this tragedy, that it was simply human error and its lack of urgency from higher-ups and management once again. The families of the Challenger crew had learned of this cover-up from NASA and Thiokol, and even a few of these families came together to sue. They eventually reached a settlement, and like the water and river, or the wind in the trees, the time had slipped away. The events of Challenger had faded out of view, and the world kept turning. There is some good that comes from this. Alan MacDonald would go on to be put in charge of redesigning the solid rocket boosters, and after that, there was never another accident like Challenger again. Many years later, after NASA had made the promise, Columbia broke up on re-entry in February of 2003. This brought the accident of Challenger back up as the media and citizens alike felt that NASA didn't make the needed safety changes. On July 21st, 2011, the Space Shuttle Atlantis made its last landing for the program, ending a technological endeavor that was laced in tragedy. The last space shuttles, Enterprise, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, are all displayed around the country. Pieces of Challenger and Columbia are displayed as a reminder for the perseverance, strength, and courage of those who had lost their lives on those days. I want to leave this video on a more positive note than how I started it. And as much as I want to be angry at the people in charge, NASA managers that I call vice presidents and everything like that, ones who rushed for a launch, who pushed for a launch, who saw the data and thought that it was inconclusive, and just, it felt like they just didn't care about the human life on board of Challenger, that they wanted to push for a date or push for a launch. Sorry, I'm just winging this right now. They wanted to push for a launch rather than be safe and be cautious, rather than disappoint the public and the news and the president again. They would rather put the lives of innocents in danger than do their job decently or wholeheartedly. It's hard to read something like this as well, to research this as well, and not be angry either. It's hard to hear what people have to say about this incident and thinking that people from higher up thought that they were making the right choice, when there are so many statements, so many quotes, and so many things that really go against with what they had said or are saying. Really frustrating. And personally, I do think there are people to blame in this. I think Thiokol management is very much to blame, and NASA management is very much to blame. And some of the things that these people that were in charge said to their own engineers and technicians, ignoring them, and all these warnings, just makes my blood boil. And it's like, it's easy for you to say when you're not the one getting on a rocket, when you're not the one being launched into space. You know, I think personally for me, if I were ever put in that kind of situation and I were in charge, I would be like, we're not risking it. The news can tear me apart. The news can put me on blast or whatever. I don't care. I would rather, protect a life than lose a life. Because even if it's not my life, it's still someone else's. Not very much a not needed sacrifice. But the thing is, I think that sooner or later something like this was going to happen. I mean, look, a few years down in 2003, Columbia happened. It's a dangerous business, obviously, and I'm glad that NASA is finally telling astronauts that this is a risky business, that anything could happen and everything. And I'm glad that NASA is finally taking the precautions to delay launches by days, months, years sometimes, to be like, we're going to make sure everything's right, and we're going to make sure these people are coming home. And I guess I would just want to say thank you to Francis and Mike and John and Ellison and Judith and Greg and Krista, because I got to experience something amazing because of what happened to them. Because NASA was able to make the right changes and able to put in the right safety measures, finally, to have a safe launch. That is a gift, in my opinion, and I'm trying not to get too sappy or try not to cry too much because I did work a little hard on my makeup. But thank them for their sacrifice for allowing us to have safe space travel. And not just them, but like Columbia and Apollo 1 and just all the people that, you know, lost their lives for the sake of pushing humanity into the future. And I would just like to say, I think everyone would be proud for how far NASA has come and how far the public has come to holding NASA accountable and making sure something like this doesn't happen again.